He was a billionaire with everything, money, fame, and power. But after losing his wife, his life fell apart. All he had left was his little daughter, the only reason he kept going. Yet, even with all his fortune, he couldn't protect her. Doctors came and went, treatments failed, and hope began to fade. One by one, he fired every maid in the house, 15 in total, because none could handle the pressure, the silence, or his pain. Then, one day, a quiet woman arrived. She didn't ask questions. She just worked, gently, patiently. What he didn't know was that his daughter would soon face something far worse, an illness no money could cure. And when all hope was lost, that same woman, the one everyone overlooked, would do something no one could explain. A simple act that would change their lives forever and leave the billionaire speechless. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Walters was once one of the most powerful men in the pharmaceutical industry. He built a fortune over decades, investing in drug research and managing a company that treated illnesses around the world. But after his wife died from a rare disease that no treatment could stop, Richard completely changed. He left the public eye, quit his leadership roles, and disappeared into his private life. He now spent his days in his large, quiet mansion, which sat far from the city. The house, once full of activity and visitors, had become silent. His only focus now was his 7-year-old daughter, Emily. She had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive type of kidney cancer. Richard stopped working the moment he received the news. He turned all his energy and money toward trying to save her. He hired private doctors and nurses to care for her full-time. Emily's condition, however, continued to get worse, and the house felt colder and darker with each passing week. Emily's illness had changed everything. She had been a lively and curious child, always asking questions and laughing at the smallest things. But the cancer treatments were hard on her body. The chemotherapy caused her to lose all her hair. She became weaker, thinner, and quieter. The nurses came in and out of the house, carrying medical equipment, adjusting machines, and giving her medication. Richard followed every detail of the treatment, asking questions, reading medical papers, and talking with the specialists he hired. But no matter what he did, it never seemed enough. Emily spent most of her time in bed, connected to machines that helped her breathe and fed her medicine through tubes. She rarely smiled anymore. The pain made it hard for her to talk. Richard sat next to her every day, reading her stories or just holding her hand while she rested. He refused to leave her side, afraid that something might happen when he wasn't there. The once beautiful mansion now felt like a hospital. The large rooms were filled with the sound of medical monitors and quiet footsteps. Lights stayed on through the night, and nurses worked in shifts. Richard had converted one of the bedrooms into a treatment room, where Emily spent most of her time. Her toys were packed away. There were no more drawings on the walls, no laughter in the halls. It was as if time had stopped. Richard barely ate or slept. He spent most nights in a chair by Emily's bed, watching her chest rise and fall with each breath. Sometimes he cried quietly, afraid to make noise and wake her. He would hold her small hand, feeling the difference between her fragile body and the strong grip she used to have. No amount of wealth, influence, or science seemed able to change what was happening. He felt useless and broken, knowing he was losing her day by day. Richard had tried everything money could buy. He contacted the best hospitals in the world, paid for experimental treatments, and even sponsored a new research project to study Emily's cancer. He arranged private video calls with specialists in Europe and Asia, looking for a solution that others may have missed. He spent hours going through test results, scans, and reports, but each new attempt ended in disappointment. The treatments made Emily feel worse instead of better. The doctors warned him that her condition was too advanced. Still, Richard refused to give up. He kept searching, kept paying, kept hoping that maybe the next idea would work, but deep inside he was terrified. He could see how tired Emily was. Her eyes no longer lit up when he walked into the room. She stopped asking for her favorite stories and didn't want to eat anything anymore. Richard began to understand that he might not be able to save her. The nights were the hardest. While the rest of the house was dark and quiet, Richard sat by her bedside, unable to sleep. The soft beeping of machines was the only sound around him. He watched her breathing, slow and shallow, and stared at the tubes that kept her alive. Sometimes she would wake up and whisper something, and he would lean in close to hear her weak voice. Most of the time she just slept, her small body still under the blankets. Richard thought about all the times he was too busy working when his wife and daughter needed him. He remembered missing dinners, skipping vacations, and putting his job first. Now, none of that mattered. All he wanted was for Emily to live. He would have traded everything, his money, his business, even his own life, to take her pain away. But nothing he did could stop the cancer. He had never felt so powerless. Despite all the care, all the treatments, and all the sacrifices, Emily's condition stayed uncertain. Every day was a battle between hope and fear. Some mornings she seemed a little better, and Richard would feel a spark of relief. But by the afternoon a new problem would appear, an infection, a drop in her blood pressure, or another sign that her body was struggling. The doctors were careful with their words, but Richard could read their expressions. They didn't think she would survive. He held on to hope anyway. He had to. As long as she was breathing, there was still a chance. But as he sat there, watching her sleep, he knew the truth. He had everything money could buy, yet none of it could fix this. Emily's life was slipping away, and all he could do was sit beside her night after night, feeling completely helpless. The Walters mansion had gone through many changes in recent months. After several caregivers had quit, the atmosphere had become even more tense. Most of them left after only a few weeks. Some said the pressure was too much. Others said Richard Walters was too demanding, or that the sadness in the house was unbearable. Then came Grace Miller. She arrived early in the morning on a Monday. She didn't bring many belongings and spoke very little. Her appearance was simple, and she didn't try to draw attention to herself. During her first meeting with Richard, she didn't ask questions about the child or the illness. She simply said she would prefer to help with cleaning and household tasks. That was all. She didn't mention her past or give reasons for wanting the job. She didn't smile much, but there was something calm in her behavior. Richard, exhausted from the constant changes in staff, simply nodded and let her start. No one expected much from her at first. Grace began her work quietly. She didn't complain about the strict routines or the constant presence of medical staff. She cleaned the rooms, swept the floors, and took out the trash. The house was large, with long halls and many closed doors. It had the smell of medicine, plastic, and disinfectant. The sound of machines could be heard in the background. Grace didn't show any discomfort. She worked silently, moving from one room to another. She never interrupted conversations between the doctors or got in the way of the nurses. She avoided contact with Richard and didn't try to speak with Emily. When she passed the girl sitting in her armchair, she would only give a small nod or a gentle smile. Emily, with her head wrapped in a scarf, always had her favorite doll in her arms. She didn't say much either. The girl often sat quietly, looking at magazines or just staring ahead. Grace respected that space and kept her distance. As the days passed, Grace noticed small things about Emily. She saw that every morning there was a half-full glass of milk left on the small table near the window. Emily rarely touched it. There were children's magazines lying around, always open to the same pages. The girl didn't seem to read them, but liked having them nearby. Grace didn't say anything. She just started adjusting things slightly. She began changing the milk earlier so it would still be warm when left on the table. She picked up new magazines from the nearby shop and quietly left them where the old ones had been. No one told her to do these things, and she didn't mention them to anyone. Emily didn't react at first. She didn't ask who had made the changes, but she stopped ignoring the milk. Sometimes she would take a few sips. She began turning the pages of the magazines, even if slowly. Grace never pointed out these changes. She just kept observing and making small adjustments. Grace's routine stayed steady. She didn't try to start conversations. She still avoided eye contact during medical procedures and always stepped out when doctors entered the room. But little by little, the staff noticed her presence. She never interfered, but somehow things felt less heavy when she was around. The other workers stopped rushing so much. The nurses didn't speak as sharply. Even Richard, still buried in his sorrow, seemed less tense when passing her in the hallway. Grace continued her daily tasks, dusting, folding, organizing. She wasn't overly friendly, but there was something consistent and calm in the way she moved and behaved. She didn't bring joy exactly, but she brought a kind of peace. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer opinions, and never stepped beyond her role. But she was there, quiet, reliable, and always paying attention. She didn't need praise or recognition. Her goal was simple: to help in the background without making anything harder than it already was. Emily remained the same on the surface. She was still weak, still quiet, and still tired from the treatments. But some things were different now. She didn't resist brushing her teeth at night. She asked for her blanket in the evening, instead of waiting for someone to notice. When she coughed, she looked toward the door, almost expecting someone to be there. Grace had started folding the child's pajamas just the way Emily liked. She placed her stuffed animals back in the exact positions where Emily had left them. Emily didn't talk to Grace, but she noticed. And Grace, without words, kept learning more about her habits. She wasn't just cleaning anymore. She was making the house more comfortable in small, invisible ways. One day, Emily dropped her doll, and before the nurse could react, Grace had already picked it up, gently wiping it off and handing it back. Emily gave a short nod. It wasn't much, but it meant something. Neither of them said anything. No one in the house made a big deal about Grace's presence. There were no compliments or announcements, but the mood began to shift. It wasn't dramatic or fast. It was quiet. The mansion, once cold and heavy, felt a little more stable. There were still bad days. Emily still had pain. Richard still carried sadness in his eyes. But the air didn't feel so suffocating. Grace never asked how Emily was doing. She never asked about the doctor's decisions or questioned the nurses. But she listened. She watched. She remembered details no one else did. If a certain pillow helped Emily sleep better, Grace made sure it was always in place. If the child responded better to softer lighting, she adjusted the lamps before nightfall. She never asked for thanks. She didn't need them, but her actions mattered. Over time, without words, Grace became a steady part of the house's rhythm. No one could explain exactly how, but her presence brought calm to a place that had almost forgotten what calm felt like. The days moved slowly inside the Walters mansion. Each morning looked like the last. Grace continued with her chores, always quiet, never trying to be noticed. She swept floors, wiped counters, folded clothes, and organized drawers. She didn't interrupt the nurses or get involved with the doctors. Her role stayed simple, but she was always paying attention. One thing she noticed more and more was how alone Emily seemed. The little girl didn't talk to anyone unless she had to. She didn't complain, but she didn't smile either. Most of the time, she just sat by the window in her room, holding her doll or looking outside. The garden was empty, the sky often grey. Emily would sit there for hours, barely moving. Even when someone entered the room, she didn't turn her head. It was clear she was tired, not just from being sick, but from everything else. The silence, the routines, the endless appointments. Grace saw it all, but never said anything out loud. Richard visited his daughter often, but there was always a strange distance in the room when he was there. He sat next to her bed and held her hand, but he looked uncomfortable, as if he didn't know what to say. His phone was usually in his pocket, and sometimes he read parts of the medical reports again, even though he already knew what they said. He wanted to be close, but he didn't know how. Emily would look at him with tired eyes, and he would try to smile, but the sadness in his face never went away. Sometimes he would talk about a new treatment or ask her how she was feeling, but the conversations were short. Grace watched him from a distance, noticing how hard he was trying and how helpless he felt. He loved his daughter deeply, but the fear and pressure had changed him. He was afraid to say the wrong thing. He was afraid of losing her, and it showed in every small movement he made. One afternoon, while Grace was organizing the shelves in the hallway, she heard a soft sound from Emily's room. When she stepped closer, she saw the little girl sitting on the floor, not in her usual chair. Her small body was shaking, and her face was buried in her hands. On the floor in front of her was a single lock of her remaining hair. She had pulled it out herself. Grace didn't speak. She walked in quietly, picked up a clean tissue from the drawer, and handed it to Emily. Then she sat down on the floor next to her. She didn't ask questions or try to comfort her with words. She just stayed there, still, close, but not too close. Emily didn't push her away. She wiped her eyes slowly and looked down at the floor. They sat in silence for a long time. No nurse came in, no machines beeped, and no one mentioned medication. For the first time in weeks, Emily wasn't being treated like a patient. She was just a child who was sad. After that day, something began to change. Emily didn't say anything, but she didn't avoid Grace anymore. Grace continued doing her tasks, but she started spending more time in Emily's room. She didn't talk much, only said a few words when needed. Instead, she began humming songs, old tunes, soft and simple. Sometimes, when she was making the bed or organizing the drawers, she would hum quietly. Emily never asked her to stop. In fact, she seemed to listen. Her body stayed still and her face more relaxed. Sometimes she even looked in Grace's direction just for a moment. It wasn't much, but it was different. Emily wasn't smiling yet, but the constant sadness in her face had lessened. Grace never pushed her to talk or interact. She just created a space that felt safe. A space where Emily didn't have to answer questions or think about test results. It was the first time someone sat near her without bringing a chart or a clipboard. Grace kept her routine. She cleaned the room, folded Emily's blankets, and adjusted the pillows. While doing so, she continued to hum or sing quietly under her breath. Emily began to notice the patterns. She seemed to wait for the songs each day, even if she didn't say anything. Grace sometimes placed a small flower in a cup by the window or brought a new magazine, opened to a different page. These small gestures were never discussed, but Emily saw them. She even started pointing at things when she wanted something moved or fixed. It was her way of communicating, slow but steady. The nurses still came in and out, and the doctors still gave updates, but in between those moments there was Grace. She didn't replace the medical care or the attention from her father, but she gave Emily something else, something quiet and steady. Emily didn't seem as restless. She didn't cry as much, and while she still looked tired, there was more peace in the room than before. It was clear now that Emily had started to trust Grace, even if she never said it directly. The quiet bond between them had grown from that one afternoon on the floor. Grace never spoke about what happened. She didn't tell the nurses or Richard. She treated the moment with care, as if it belonged only to Emily. From that point on, Emily allowed her to stay longer. Sometimes she would even lean back and close her eyes while Grace sang. The atmosphere in the room became different, less clinical, more human. There were still hard days, days when Emily felt too sick to move or speak, but she didn't seem as lost. Grace remained nearby, never pushing, never changing her approach. She just stayed. That simple, quiet presence became a part of Emily's daily life. It was the first time someone sat with her without talking about her illness, without asking about the future or checking the clock. Grace simply stayed by her side, and that was exactly what Emily needed. It was a rainy night when Richard arrived at the mansion earlier than usual. His driver dropped him off at the main entrance, and instead of going directly to his office or checking in with the nurses, he decided to walk through the living room. The house was dimly lit, and the sound of rain hitting the windows filled the silence. As he stepped into the room, something made him stop. Across the room, near the fireplace, he saw Grace and Emily. They hadn't noticed him yet. He didn't move. He didn't say a word. What he saw froze him in place. Emily was sitting on a small stool, her back slightly hunched, her hands resting in her lap. Her head was completely bald now, not a single strand of hair left. In front of her, kneeling carefully, was Grace. Her hands were shaking as she held something close to Emily's head, a wig. But it wasn't just any wig. It was the exact same color and texture as Grace's own dark brown hair. Grace's eyes were red, and tears rolled down her cheeks, but she kept going, gently placing the wig over Emily's head. Her movements were slow and careful, like she didn't want to make a mistake. Emily didn't say anything at first. She let Grace adjust the wig, softly touching her head and smoothing out the strands. Then Grace reached for a small hand mirror from the table nearby and held it up in front of the girl. Emily looked at her reflection in silence. She touched the wig lightly, then turned her eyes to Grace. Her face was calm, but her voice was almost a whisper when she spoke. "You want to be my mom?" she asked. Her words were simple, not loud, but they hit harder than anything Richard had ever heard. He felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't explain. He saw Grace freeze, still holding the mirror, her face frozen in shock. She didn't answer right away. The room stayed quiet. Then, without saying anything, Grace put the mirror down and reached out to Emily. She pulled the girl into a tight hug. It wasn't a gentle or polite hug. It was firm, emotional, and real. Emily leaned into her, wrapping her small arms around Grace's neck. Richard could see her eyes close, resting her head against Grace's shoulder. Grace cried harder now, but she didn't let go. She held Emily like she had waited her whole life to do it. There were no words exchanged, no explanations or promises, but something important had happened in that moment. Richard, still standing at the entrance to the room, felt the tears forming in his own eyes. He didn't try to stop them. He didn't want to move. He just watched. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about treatments, medical bills, or test results. He was seeing his daughter not as a patient, but as a child. And he was seeing something else too, something real. That scene, simple as it was, changed everything for Richard. For months he had been surrounded by experts, technology, and solutions. He had bought the best treatments, hired the most respected doctors, and followed every possible lead. But in that room, in front of that quiet moment between Grace and Emily, he understood that none of that mattered as much as he thought. Grace hadn't come from a hospital or a research lab. She didn't wear a white coat or carry a chart. Yet in the middle of all the silence and pain, she had brought something that no one else could. Her tears weren't out of pity or duty. They came from something honest. And when she hugged Emily, she didn't do it to comfort or distract. She did it because she truly cared. Richard had never seen Emily look at someone like that. He had never seen her ask something so direct. That question, so small but so powerful, showed him what was missing in their lives. For a long time, the mansion had felt like a hospital. It was clean, quiet, and efficient, but it had no warmth. The people inside did their jobs, but they didn't stay. Grace had been different from the start. She never talked about herself, never asked for more than what was given, and never tried to take anyone's place. But little by little, she had built something with Emily. It started with a quiet presence, a clean room, a soft song, and now it had grown into something Emily trusted. Richard saw it clearly now. Grace didn't want to impress anyone. She just wanted Emily to feel safe. When Emily asked her that question, she wasn't confused. She knew what she was asking. She wanted someone to be with her, not as a nurse, not as a guest, but as a mother. It was the kind of connection Richard had been too scared to hope for. But here it was, happening in front of him. He stood there for several minutes, not wanting to interrupt. The rain outside continued, and the house stayed quiet. Grace was still hugging Emily, and the girl hadn't moved. Richard felt the tears running down his face. He didn't wipe them away. He let them fall. This was the first time in many months that something broke the stillness of the house. Not a machine, not a test result, not a nurse rushing in, but something human. A child's question, a woman's honest tears, a silent hug. Richard had spent so long looking for answers in science, thinking that money could fix everything. But now he saw that some things couldn't be bought. What Grace gave Emily wasn't part of her job. It wasn't something from a contract. It was care, plain and simple. It was the one thing he hadn't thought to ask for, and the one thing that made the biggest difference. In that moment, Richard understood what he had been missing all along. As Richard stood there, watching, he felt a new kind of emotion rise inside him. It wasn't just sadness or guilt. It was something else, something like hope. Not hope in a cure or a miracle, but in the simple fact that Emily wasn't alone anymore. She had someone by her side, someone who saw her not as a medical case, but as a little girl. He didn't step forward. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. That moment wasn't his to take. It was Emily's and Grace's. He just stood there, letting himself feel it fully. In that moment, everything became clear. The silence that had filled the house for so long had finally been broken, not with noise, but with meaning. Richard realized that what he had witnessed was something real, something honest, something no amount of wealth could ever create. He had spent months trying to buy comfort, but now, for the first time, he had seen what true care looked like, and that changed everything. After that emotional night, Richard began to watch Grace more closely. Something in him had changed. He no longer saw her as just a housekeeper or a quiet presence in the background. Now he noticed every little thing she did. How she tied Emily's shoelaces with extra care. How she added an extra pillow behind her back when she sat in the chair. How she listened without interrupting when Emily wanted to talk about something silly or random. The bond between them was no longer something forming in secret. It had become obvious. Emily now smiled more often. Her eyes followed Grace around the room. When she was tired, she would reach out her hand for her. Richard noticed that Grace had become part of their daily lives in a way that no one else had, and Grace never pushed or demanded anything. She simply stayed present. Her quiet voice, calm movements, and constant attention became part of Emily's routine, as natural as the nurses or the machines in the room. The connection between Grace and Emily grew stronger each day. Grace now read stories to her every night before bed. Sometimes Emily chose the same book 3 days in a row, and Grace never complained. She gave each story life through her voice, even acting out silly parts just to make Emily laugh. She helped with meals, making them feel less like chores and more like shared moments. Emily even began to eat a little better when Grace was the one feeding her. When it was time for chemotherapy sessions, Emily no longer cried or begged to skip them. She still didn't like them, but if Grace was coming along, she felt more at ease. Grace sat next to her, holding her hand through the long hours, keeping her distracted with quiet stories or silly games. The dark brown wig Grace had given Emily became a part of her identity. She wore it proudly, fixing it carefully each morning. It wasn't just hair, it was a reminder of Grace and everything she meant. One afternoon, the doctor called Richard for a private conversation. He looked serious, holding a folder filled with new test results. He explained that Emily's condition had worsened. Her kidneys were now failing rapidly, and there was no way to reverse the damage. The only solution was a transplant. Richard felt the floor drop under his feet. The doctor continued, explaining how difficult it would be to find a compatible donor, especially in such a short amount of time. Richard didn't waste a second. He gathered his team, contacted every hospital and clinic he had connections with, and began sending urgent donor search requests. He reached out to international facilities, research centers, and private networks. Everyone was instructed to treat the matter as a top priority. Despite all the effort and resources, the early results were not encouraging. The waiting lists were long, the matches were rare, and time was not on their side. Richard tried to stay hopeful, but the pressure was building. While Richard managed the medical side of things, Grace stayed focused on Emily's emotional well-being. She understood that Emily was aware of more than people assumed. The little girl noticed the worried looks between the adults, the extra visits from the doctors, and the longer meetings behind closed doors. So, Grace made a point of keeping things as normal and cheerful as possible inside Emily's room. She brought in fresh flowers every few days, changing the colors and placing them in vases on the windowsill. She helped Emily draw pictures of animals, trees, or even silly monsters with long arms and funny eyes. They hung the drawings on the walls to make the room feel less like a hospital and more like a home. Grace sang soft songs while tidying up and often let Emily pick what music to play. Even the nurses noticed the difference. Emily was more relaxed, less afraid, and more willing to speak up during her checkups. Grace's presence brought comfort that medicine couldn't offer. The most touching part for Richard was hearing Emily call Grace Mommy. It started quietly, almost without meaning to. One day Emily asked, "Mommy, can you help me with my blanket?" and didn't even realize she had said it. Grace didn't correct her. She just smiled and helped. After that, it happened more often. Sometimes in the middle of the night, Emily would whisper "Mommy" when she needed something, and Grace was always there. Richard watched this happen with mixed emotions. There was a part of him that hurt hearing it. He thought of his late wife, of how Emily barely remembered her. But another part of him felt deeply grateful. Emily wasn't calling out in fear or pain. She was reaching for someone who made her feel safe and loved. Grace never asked for that title, never expected it. Yet Emily gave it to her naturally, without anyone telling her to. It came from trust, from comfort, from something real that had formed between them. Richard continued to fight, calling doctors daily, checking for donor updates, and refusing to accept defeat. But at the same time, he had come to understand something important. The most valuable thing in Emily's world right now wasn't a medical breakthrough, it was Grace. Her kindness, her attention, and her quiet strength were holding everything together. Richard watched as Emily, even in her weakest moments, looked for Grace. Whether it was during a painful injection or a moment of silence, Grace was the person she needed. And Grace never failed her. She never asked for time off, never complained, and never showed fear in front of the girl. She was always calm, always present. As the search for a donor continued with no success, Richard began to see that even though he couldn't fix everything, he had found something that gave Emily hope. In her own way, Emily had chosen Grace, not just as her caretaker, but as someone she believed in. And that meant everything. The search for a kidney donor had become a long and frustrating process. Richard had spared no resources. Dozens of people were tested, including hospital volunteers, distant relatives, and even people outside the country through private programs. Still, none were a match. Every time the phone rang, Richard hoped for good news. But each time the answer was the same. No match found. The pressure was growing. The doctors warned him that time was running out. Emily's condition was worsening, and if a donor wasn't found soon, her chances would drop drastically. Richard spent most of his days making calls, signing papers, and reviewing files from potential donors. The hope that someone would eventually match was all he had left. The entire staff felt the weight of the situation. Nurses moved more quietly, doctors avoided eye contact, and even Grace, who usually brought calm to the house, said even less than usual. The silence in the halls of the mansion felt heavier than ever before. One morning, Grace was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters and putting away clean dishes. It was early, and the house was still quiet. She could hear Richard in the next room talking on the phone. His voice was low, but the frustration and sadness were clear. He was telling someone that all the tests so far had failed and that he didn't know what else to do. Grace paused, listening without meaning to. There was a long pause in Richard's voice. He sounded like a man who had reached his limit. After the call ended, Grace didn't say anything to him. She just continued with her routine. But later that day, without talking to anyone else, she quietly approached the hospital staff and asked if she could be tested. She didn't tell Emily. She didn't tell Richard. She didn't even act differently around the house. Grace continued to work, help with meals, read stories, and bring flowers to the room, just like she always had. 2 weeks passed. Nothing seemed different on the surface. Emily's condition was stable, but fragile. The transplant team was still running tests, and the list of failed donor matches continued to grow. Then, one afternoon, the head doctor asked to speak with Richard privately. He led him into the consultation room and handed him a folder. "We found a match," he said. Richard looked at the paper and then looked up, confused. "Who?" The doctor looked at him and said, "Grace Miller." Richard stared at him for several seconds without speaking. He had no idea she had even taken the test. "Does she understand what this means?" he asked, still in shock. The doctor nodded. She said there's nothing to think about. She wants to do it. Richard didn't know what to say. Grace, who had quietly taken care of his daughter, was now willing to go through surgery to save her. He felt a wave of emotions, gratitude, disbelief, fear, but mostly respect for the woman who had changed everything. That evening, Richard found Grace sitting in the garden. He walked over and sat down across from her. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then finally he asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" Grace didn't look surprised. She simply said, "Because it wasn't about me. It's about Emily." He nodded slowly, still trying to understand the depth of what she was offering. "You could get hurt," he said. "I know," she replied, "but she needs this. And I want her to live." Her voice was calm and steady, the same way it always was. There was no drama, no big speech, just a quiet certainty. Richard wanted to argue, to protect her from the risks, but he also knew that without a donor, Emily wouldn't survive. Grace had made her decision. The next morning, the hospital began the official preparations. They scheduled the surgeries, assigned the medical teams, and started the necessary paperwork. The news spread quickly, and everyone at the hospital was moved by what she was willing to do. Over the next few days, the house was filled with activity. Doctors visited often, checking both Grace and Emily. Nurses explained the procedures, and papers were signed. Richard stayed close, making sure every step was handled carefully. The hospital team treated Grace with a new level of respect. She wasn't just a staff member anymore, she was a donor, a lifesaver. The medical director even came to the house to personally thank her. Grace didn't seek attention. She avoided long conversations and kept doing her usual tasks, but there was a change in how people looked at her. She had done something no one expected. Emily was told that someone very special had been found to help her. The doctors kept the explanation simple, not going into too much detail. They wanted her to stay calm. When she heard the news, Emily smiled, a real smile, full of joy. It was the first time in months that her face lit up. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she felt hope. That small smile was all Grace needed. It told her that everything was worth it. Emily didn't cry or panic. Instead, she asked what kind of help she was going to get. The doctors explained that someone had offered something very important, something that would help her body get stronger again. Emily hugged her doll and said, "That sounds nice." She didn't ask who it was. She didn't know that Grace was the one giving her part of herself. But her calmness showed how safe she felt. The rooms in the mansion didn't feel so heavy anymore. There was still fear, still uncertainty, but there was also something new, hope. Grace continued to stay by her side, singing softly, helping her get dressed and brushing the wig gently. Richard watched the two of them together and understood, maybe more clearly than ever, that Grace wasn't just helping. She was giving Emily a real chance to live. And that kind of gift went far beyond anything money could buy. The surgery took place on a cold and quiet morning. The hospital halls were empty, and everything felt slower than usual. Grace was taken into the operating room first. She didn't say much before being rolled away on the stretcher. She gave Richard a small nod and a tired smile, but her face was pale and serious. Richard stood in the hallway, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, staring at the closed doors. Nurses moved around him, speaking softly, preparing instruments and confirming instructions. He didn't speak to anyone unless necessary. When the doctors came to take Emily into surgery, Richard walked beside her bed until the last possible moment. She was sleepy from the pre-surgery medication, holding her doll close to her chest. She gave him a small wave before the doors closed. Then, all he could do was wait. The next several hours passed slowly. Richard paced, sat down, stood back up, and checked his watch over and over again. He had never felt so helpless. After what felt like an eternity, one of the doctors came out to speak with him. The transplant had been completed. It had gone as planned. No unexpected complications. Richard nodded slowly, taking a deep breath, but the doctor reminded him that they still had to wait. Emily had been moved to the ICU and would be watched closely for the next several days. The first 72 hours were the most important. Richard thanked the doctor and went to check on Grace. She had been taken to a recovery room. She was still unconscious, pale, and looked weaker than he had ever seen her. But her breathing was steady, and her vital signs were good. He sat next to her for a while, then moved to the ICU to be with Emily. Machines surrounded her bed, tubes were connected to her arms. A screen tracked her heartbeat. She looked so small under the blankets, so fragile. Richard sat in silence, his thoughts racing between hope and fear. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Nurses came in and out at all hours. Doctors reviewed test results, adjusting medications and monitoring signs of rejection. Emily remained asleep most of the time, her body working hard to adjust. Grace, in a separate room, slowly regained consciousness. She was weak and in pain, but her expression remained calm. She didn't ask for anything, and only nodded quietly when nurses checked her vitals or changed her IVs. Richard divided his time between them. He spent a few hours with Emily, then walked down the hall to sit beside Grace. He barely slept. He didn't leave the hospital. Every time a doctor approached him, his heart beat faster. He expected either bad news or small progress updates. No one could predict what would happen next. He saw how much pain Grace was in and how peaceful she tried to appear, and he saw how Emily slowly showed small signs of improvement, tiny movements, slightly better numbers on the monitors, and occasional twitches in her fingers. On the fourth day, the results finally arrived. The test showed that Emily's body had accepted the new kidney. There were no signs of rejection. Her blood pressure was stable and her kidney function had started to improve. The doctor delivered the news with a smile. Richard didn't know what to say at first. He just stared, then slowly nodded. He went to Grace's room to tell her, and although she could barely speak, she smiled and closed her eyes as if letting go of a heavy weight. The staff shared the news across the hospital. Nurses hugged each other in the hallway. A few even cried. Everyone who had followed the case knew how rare and difficult it had been. Emily's condition had been critical. The donor search had almost failed. Yet, against all odds, it had worked. Doctors described the case as one of the most unlikely successes they had seen. Some even called it a miracle. Richard didn't argue. He just stayed close, watching his daughter slowly return to life. What surprised the medical team most was how perfect the match had been. It was rare enough to find a compatible donor, especially under time pressure. But the level of match between Grace and Emily went far beyond what was expected. Blood type, tissue type, even secondary factors. They all lined up almost exactly. The head surgeon called it unusual, almost unexplainable. He reviewed the files several times, making sure there hadn't been a mistake in the tests. There hadn't. Grace, who had come into their lives quietly, had given Emily not only care and comfort, but now a part of her body that was helping her survive. Richard thought about all the people who had tried to help before, all the experts, all the scientists. None of them could have predicted this outcome. The hospital documented every detail. Medical students and specialists came to learn about the case. But no matter how they tried to understand it, they couldn't fully explain the connection between the two. For the first time in his life, Richard felt something he had never truly believed in: faith. He didn't mean religious faith or spiritual answers, but a deep feeling that some things happen beyond reason or control. He had spent his whole life believing in facts, science, logic, and money. Everything could be measured, explained, or fixed. But what happened with Grace and Emily didn't fit any formula. It was something else. He had watched his daughter slip away slowly, watched her suffer while nothing seemed to work. And then, without warning, Grace had changed everything. Not with money, not with knowledge, but with a choice. A personal decision made from care, not calculation. As he sat by Emily's bed, now watching her breathing calmly for the first time in weeks, Richard felt something new. It wasn't fear or guilt or pressure. It was quiet. It was relief. And somewhere deep inside, it felt like hope. Maybe even something close to belief. Something he never expected to feel, but now couldn't ignore. Over the following weeks, Emily's health continued to improve in small but meaningful ways. At first, she began eating a little more during meals. Instead of refusing food or pushing the plate away, she started asking for small portions of her favorite things: toast, fruit slices, warm soup. Slowly, she regained her appetite. A few days later, she asked if she could sit by the window instead of staying in bed. The nurses helped her, and from that moment, she started spending more time outside her room. Eventually, she began walking again, first with assistance, then holding the wall, and later moving slowly through the hallways by herself. Her steps were small, and she still tired easily, but the progress was obvious. She wandered through the mansion, stopping to look at family photos or to sit for a moment on the staircase. Grace, still weak from surgery, stayed in bed for most of the day, but she was always nearby, asking the nurses about Emily's condition or watching from her door with a soft smile. Grace's recovery was slower, but steady. She didn't complain about the pain or the fatigue. She rested when needed and followed the doctor's advice. Every morning, Richard visited her room to check on her. He would sit beside her for a few minutes, sometimes bringing tea or reading short updates from the hospital. Grace always thanked him with a quiet voice and a calm expression. Though she still moved slowly, she insisted on seeing Emily whenever she could. On days when she had enough strength, she walked a few steps just to greet the girl. Emily always smiled when she saw her. Their connection hadn't changed. If anything, it had grown stronger. Emily often sat near Grace's door, telling her about her walks, her meals, or her plans to draw something new. Grace listened closely, never interrupting. Their bond didn't need many words. It was clear in the way Emily leaned toward her, or how Grace's eyes lit up at the sound of her voice. Richard saw it all. He noticed how Emily looked healthier, more alive. He watched as she moved around the house with more confidence, checking on Grace and sharing little stories from her day. He couldn't hide his gratitude anymore. It was visible in the way he spoke to Grace, in how he took care of her during her recovery, and in the way he made sure everything she needed was provided. He started stepping away from the company more often. Tasks that once demanded his constant presence were now handled by trusted employees. He made calls from home, held shorter meetings, and focused most of his time on his daughter and Grace. He brought home flowers, arranged meals, and even helped with small things like preparing Emily's bedroom or adjusting Grace's pillows. Richard was no longer just the distant father or the busy businessman. He had changed. Now he was fully present. His role in the house was no longer passive. He was an active part of their healing. At first, Grace tried to keep some distance. She didn't want to overstep. Even after everything that had happened, she reminded herself she was not family. She had come into the house as an employee, and even though the situation had changed, she still felt unsure of her place. But Richard didn't treat her as staff anymore. He treated her with deep respect. He looked at her differently now, not just as the woman who had cared for his daughter, but as someone he truly admired. Grace noticed the change. She felt it in the way he spoke to her, in the way he sat longer by her side, asking how she felt and genuinely listening. Though she tried to maintain boundaries, it was hard to ignore the kindness and attention he gave her. They began to talk more. Short conversations at first, then longer ones in the evening when the house was quiet. The respect between them grew quietly, without pressure or expectation. As the days went by, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. The silence that once filled every corner was replaced by small sounds. Emily's footsteps down the hall, Grace's quiet humming, and Richard's voice reading out loud during bedtime. There were smells again. Warm soup in the kitchen, clean sheets, fresh flowers on the table. Laughter returned too. It was soft at first, uncertain, but real. Emily laughed when Grace teased her about her messy drawings. Richard laughed when Emily told silly stories. Grace smiled more. Everyone moved a little more freely through the space. The cold feeling that once defined the mansion was disappearing. It was still a large, quiet home, but now it felt like people lived there, not just physically but emotionally. There was connection, there was healing. Rooms once shut were opened again. Lights stayed on a little longer in the evening. The staff noticed the difference. The house wasn't just a place of illness and sadness anymore. It was becoming something else entirely, a home again. Emily continued getting stronger. She walked more, ate more, and talked more. She returned to her room less often during the day and preferred spending time in the living room or garden. She asked questions, made plans, and even helped the nurses with small tasks. Grace still needed time to fully recover, but her strength was returning too. Richard remained at home, rarely leaving their side. The three of them started spending evenings together, watching movies, sharing stories, or simply sitting in silence. There were no big declarations or complicated discussions, but something important had changed. They had become a kind of family, even if no one said the word out loud. Richard looked at Grace with deep respect, and Grace looked back with quiet gratitude. What had started as a tragedy had become something unexpected, a new beginning. And though none of them knew what the future would bring, the house now felt different. It had life again. And that life, slowly and carefully, was coming back to stay. Months had passed since the transplant, and the day finally came when the doctor said Emily was well enough to go home for good. It was official. She was discharged with no more need for constant hospital care. The house staff prepared everything for her return. Her room was cleaned, her favorite blankets were washed, and new books and coloring sets were placed near her bed. Emily's hair had started to grow back. It was short and soft, a sign that the chemotherapy was behind her. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, and her energy had returned in a way that surprised everyone. She no longer needed help to walk or eat, and she even started running short distances in the hallway again. Despite having her own room, Emily asked to sleep in Grace's. Grace, now living in the house as part of the family, didn't argue. She simply moved things around to make space. Emily's presence there became part of their new routine, and no one questioned it. Grace had fully recovered from the surgery by then. Her strength returned slowly, but she never complained. Now, she helped organize daily activities, made sure Emily's medications were taken on time, and even managed a few household responsibilities that had been neglected for months. She had a quiet way of doing things, nothing loud, nothing grand, but everyone in the house noticed her role. She wasn't just an employee anymore, she was part of everything. Richard watched this shift with quiet appreciation. He no longer saw her only as the woman who had saved his daughter's life. He saw her as someone who had become essential to both of them. One afternoon, while Emily napped, Richard began to plan a small dinner. Not a big event, just something simple. He didn't tell Grace much, only that he wanted to have a quiet evening with her and Emily at the table. No doctors, no nurses, no pressure, just the three of them at home, with a meal that wasn't about treatment or survival. That evening, the dining room looked different. There were candles, not too many, just enough to give the room a warm feel. The table was set with care. Grace wore a simple dress, and Richard had changed into something more relaxed than his usual business attire. Emily sat between them, smiling, her short hair tucked behind her ears. Dinner was quiet at first. They ate, shared small stories, and laughed at one of Emily's silly jokes about vegetables. Then Richard stood up, holding a glass of water. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. He looked at Grace and said, "You gave my daughter her life back. And in doing that, you gave me mine too. I don't have the right words, but I needed you to hear that." Grace didn't respond right away. She just nodded, eyes a little wet, and looked down at her plate. Emily clapped her hands once and giggled, breaking the silence. They all laughed, and the tension eased. As dinner continued, the conversation grew lighter. They talked about Emily's plans, how she wanted to ride a bike again, go to the zoo, and maybe even visit the beach. Grace promised they would do all those things. Richard joined in, offering to plan the trip himself. The laughter came more naturally now. No one mentioned hospitals, surgeries, or doctors. They talked like people who had gone through something hard and had come out on the other side, changed, but together. Throughout the evening, Richard and Grace shared a few longer looks. Neither of them said anything more about feelings or emotions, but something unspoken hung between them. There was a calm understanding, a mutual respect that had deepened into something else. Grace didn't pull away when Richard leaned a little closer, and Richard didn't hold back his smile when she laughed. It was clear that their bond wasn't just about Emily anymore. It had grown into something they both felt, even if neither of them had said the words out loud yet. By the end of the night, Emily was exhausted. Her energy, although returning, still had limits. She fell asleep on the couch, curled up with a small blanket, her hand resting between Grace and Richard. They sat in silence for a while, watching her sleep. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock in the background. Grace reached out and gently adjusted the blanket on Emily's shoulder. Richard looked at her, then leaned in and kissed her forehead. Grace didn't move away. She didn't look surprised. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the gesture. It wasn't planned. It wasn't discussed. But it said more than anything either of them could have spoken. The connection that had grown through months of pain, struggle, and healing had reached a new point. It was no longer about survival or gratitude. It was about the life they were now sharing, day by day, choice by choice. That moment sealed something between them. No titles were used, no promises were made. But the room felt different, closer, warmer. Emily's small hand still held both of theirs as she slept, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. Richard stayed quiet, his thumb gently brushing the back of Grace's hand. She looked down at their hands and smiled. There was peace in the room, the kind that didn't need to be explained. After everything they had faced, the fear, the sleepless nights, the surgeries, the waiting, they had arrived at something rare. The family that had once been broken was whole again, even if it looked different than before. The house that had once been cold and empty now felt alive. That night, as they sat together in silence, they understood without needing to say it. They were no longer three separate people trying to survive. They had become one family, joined not by blood, but by choice, love, and the journey that had brought them together. 1 year later, life inside the Walters mansion was completely different. The once silent and somber rooms now echoed with laughter, movement, and routine. Emily was no longer the quiet, sick child lying in bed. She was now a healthy, energetic girl who attended school every weekday morning. Each day she woke up early, dressed herself, and sat at the breakfast table excited to talk about her lessons, her classmates, and the drawings she was working on. After school, she ran through the long hallways of the mansion, waving at the staff, greeting them by name, and sometimes asking if they wanted to see her homework or her new book. The house that had once felt like a hospital was now filled with life. Rooms that had been closed for months were now in use again. The garden had been cleaned and filled with new flowers. There were pictures on the walls, photos of moments that marked their healing. Birthdays, small trips, quiet dinners. Everything had changed, and everyone inside felt it. Richard and Grace had married quietly 6 months after Emily's full recovery. It wasn't a big wedding. They didn't want publicity or a large crowd. It was a simple ceremony with a few close friends, doctors, and staff who had been part of their journey. Since then, their partnership had grown into something even bigger. Together, they founded the Walters Foundation for Childhood Illnesses, an organization focused on supporting families with children suffering from rare and serious diseases. Richard used his business experience and connections to manage finances and secure partnerships. Grace, with her calm and steady presence, coordinated campaigns, organized donation drives, and visited hospitals personally to speak with parents and medical teams. They worked side by side every day, motivated by the experience they had lived. The foundation also launched a national organ donation program focused on helping children in need of transplants. It quickly gained attention due to its practical support and emotional story. The project was personal, and people responded to that. Grace found a new purpose in her work. She was no longer just the woman who had cared for a sick girl. Now she stood in front of doctors, nurses, and families as someone who understood both sides of the struggle, the fear of waiting and the risk of giving. She gave speeches, led workshops, and spent time with children undergoing treatments. Hospitals welcomed her warmly, and parents often asked for her advice. Despite all the recognition, Grace remained humble. She still returned home every night to help Emily with her homework or sit beside Richard to discuss foundation projects. Her days were full, but she never seemed overwhelmed. She had found a balance that made sense, and Richard supported her every step of the way. He no longer buried himself in work or avoided emotions. Now he took time for family, took days off, and made sure Emily felt seen and loved. They were a team, stronger together than either of them had been before. Emily continued to thrive. Her health stayed strong and her confidence grew. At school, she made friends easily and even joined a small art club. She loved to draw, especially scenes of houses, flowers, and families holding hands. Teachers often commented on how kind and thoughtful she was. She had a natural warmth that made others feel comfortable around her. At home, she stayed close to Grace, helping her pack materials for campaigns or asking questions about the children in hospitals. She had not forgotten where she came from or how close she had been to losing everything. Her bond with Grace was deeper than words. She didn't call her stepmom or Grace. She called her mom without hesitation. It was clear to everyone that Emily saw her as the heart of the family. Every hug, every smile, every shared glance between them told a story of trust, care, and love that had grown out of pain but turned into something strong and lasting. Then came the night of a special charity event. It was hosted by the foundation at a local community center. There were speeches, music, and tables filled with information about their programs. Many families, doctors, and supporters attended. Near the end of the night, a small stage was set up for final remarks. Grace was supposed to speak, but before she could stand up, Emily walked toward the microphone. She was wearing a simple dress and holding a small note card. The room fell silent as she reached the center of the stage. Her voice was small, but steady. "This is my mommy," she said, pointing at Grace. "She gave me a kidney and a heart." For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the entire room stood up and clapped. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Richard, who was already crying, a proud smile on his face. Emily, standing confidently, looked over at both of them and stretched out her arms for a hug. Grace stepped forward first, wrapping Emily in her arms. Then Richard joined, placing one hand on Emily's back and another around Grace's shoulder. The three of them stood there on the stage, holding each other while the applause continued. No one in the room missed the meaning of the moment. It wasn't just about a successful surgery or a foundation or a donation. It was about everything they had been through and everything they had become. Grace had once been a stranger. Richard had once been a man broken by grief. Emily had once been a child too sick to walk. Now they were a family, real, strong, and united not by chance, but by love and choice. That hug, under the soft lights of the stage, said everything. They didn't need a speech to explain it. The journey they had shared, the sacrifices made, the trust built, and the quiet acts of care had all led to this. A family, born from pain, now standing whole. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.